What shattered mind lies behind the greatest philosophy of suffering ever conceived? A mother's cruelty so extreme it would make Medea blush? A loneliness so vast it swallowed continents? And one terrifying revelation: your entire life has been scripted by a woman's love or neglect. Schopenhauer didn't just predict male suffering, he dissected its origin with surgical precision, leaving us a corpse on the table called mother love and the scalpel to autopsy ourselves. Imagine a boy, no older than 6, standing frozen in the doorway of his parents' bedroom. His father, a hollow-cheeked merchant, lies wheezing in bed, his body devoured by tuberculosis. His mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty, sits at a writing desk, scribbling letters to her lovers. The boy, Arthur, clutches a toy soldier, waiting for her to turn around. She never does. Decades later, that boy would write, "The happiness of most men is ruined by marriage and family life, just as a poisonous plant ruins the soil around it." This is not a sob story. This is a case study. Schopenhauer's hatred for his mother wasn't petty resentment. It was forensic. He dissected her influence with the precision of a surgeon, and what he found was this: your mother's emotional absence doesn't just hurt you, it architects your entire existence. Modern psychology calls it attachment theory. Schopenhauer called it the will's betrayal by the very hand that should have nourished it. Let's pause here. Think of the last time you felt an inexplicable rage, not at your boss, not at the world, but at something deeper, something you couldn't name. That's not depression, that's not anxiety. That's the ghost of your mother's neglect whispering to you from the cellar of your subconscious. A 2007 study in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry found that men who experienced maternal rejection before age 7 were 300% more likely to develop narcissistic or avoidant personality disorders. Schopenhauer knew this before the study existed. He wrote, "The boy who is denied love learns 2 things: that he is unworthy of it, and that he must become worthy by force." Now, let's talk about force. In 19th century Germany, a man named Daniel Schreber, a judge and father of the infamous paranoid schizophrenic Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, raised his son under a regime of soul murder. Cold baths at dawn, rigid posture drills, and a whip for any display of weakness. The son, Daniel Paul Schreber, would later hallucinate God turning him into a woman. Freud analyzed him, Lacan analyzed him, but Schopenhauer would have recognized the pattern instantly. A mother's emotional absence is replaced by a father's tyranny, and the boy is left with a choice: collapse into madness or weaponize his suffering. Schopenhauer chose the latter. His mother, Johanna, was a celebrated novelist who hosted salons with Goethe and mocked her son's dullness in front of guests. When Arthur published his first book, On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, she sneered, "A book written by you? Unreadable." He never spoke to her again. 20 years later, her corpse was found half-eaten by rats in her mansion. Schopenhauer, upon hearing the news, wrote a single line in his journal: "The will has corrected its mistake." This is where most men fail. They think their mother's neglect was an accident, a footnote in their story. Schopenhauer knew better. He understood that a boy unloved by his mother does one of 3 things. He destroys himself: alcohol, recklessness, suicide. He destroys others: narcissism, tyranny, cruelty, or he transcends. Which path have you taken? Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you've ever felt a gnawing emptiness after coitus, a rage at women who ignore you, or a compulsive need to prove yourself in the business or the gym, you are not broken. You are programmed. A 2015 Harvard study found that men with emotionally distant mothers were 47% more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors, from gambling to extreme sports. Schopenhauer called it the will's rebellion against its own starvation. But there's a way out. Schopenhauer's escape wasn't therapy, it wasn't love. It was art, asceticism, and the ruthless examination of suffering. He never married, he never sought approval. He lived alone with a poodle named Atma, Sanskrit for soul, and wrote The World as Will and Representation, a book so dense it was used as a doorstop for decades. Yet buried in its pages is the key to male redemption, the realization that your mother's failure was never about you. It was about her own enslavement to the will, the blind, screaming force that drives all life to reproduce and suffer. So ask yourself, are you still that boy in the doorway, waiting for her to turn around? Or are you ready to see the truth that her neglect was the greatest gift she could have given you? Because a man who knows he was never loved is a man who cannot be controlled. But what if I told you Schopenhauer's hatred of women wasn't hatred at all? What if it was the only form of love he could trust? Now we dive into the forbidden text, where Schopenhauer reveals why women fear the men they create and how you can weaponize that fear to reclaim your soul.
There's a passage in Schopenhauer's private journals, never published in his lifetime, scrubbed from early editions by scandalized editors, where he writes something so venomous, so brutally honest, that it makes Beyond Good and Evil read like a nursery rhyme. It's a single line, scribbled in the margin of a draft. Women do not love men, they love what men can become and hate what they do. Let that sink in. This isn't the ranting of a lonely misanthrope. This is the observation of a man who watched his mother, a woman of letters and high society, charm Goethe with one hand while strangling her son's spirit with the other. Johanna Schopenhauer didn't just neglect Arthur, she studied him the way a biologist studies a failed experiment. And in that cold, clinical disdain, Schopenhauer discovered a universal law. A woman's love is conditional upon your utility, and her contempt is inevitable once you fulfill it. You felt this. That girlfriend who adored you when you were struggling, but lost respect the moment you succeeded. The mother who praised your humility as a boy, but mocked your ambition as a man. Even the female readers of this very channel who'll dismiss these words as bitter, while secretly recognizing their own manipulations. Schopenhauer called it the maternal paradox, the fact that women are biologically programmed to nurture potential but resent actualization. A 2013 study in Personality and Social Psychology Review confirmed it. Women consistently rate ambitious men as more attractive until those men achieve dominance, at which point they're perceived as threatening. History is littered with the corpses of men who didn't understand this. Take Friedrich Nietzsche, Schopenhauer's intellectual heir, who spent his life craving the approval of women only to be driven mad by their betrayal. His mother, Franziska, smothered him with piety and guilt. His sister, Elizabeth, forged his manuscripts to fit her agenda. And Lou Salome, the woman he loved, used his vulnerability as material for her psychoanalytic experiments. By the time Nietzsche collapsed in a Turin street, hugging a horse and weeping, he'd written the truth in Zarathustra. You go to women, do not forget the whip. But it was too late. The women in his life had already wielded it. Schopenhauer escaped this fate through sheer, unflinching disgust. He never married, he never debased himself for female validation. Instead, he turned his loneliness into a weapon, writing, "The more a man is capable of solitude, the more he understands the horror of being needed." And here's where most men fail. They assume that because women need them for protection, resources, status, they must therefore value them. Schopenhauer knew better. He saw that dependency breeds resentment, and resentment breeds cruelty. Consider the case of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Mad King who built Neuschwanstein, the castle that inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty. Ludwig was a romantic, a man who worshipped Wagner's operas and dreamed of chivalric love. His mother, Queen Marie, raised him on fairy tales, then recoiled when he tried to live them. By 35, he was drowning in debt and delusion, wandering his palace in a cape, speaking to imaginary knights. When his ministers declared him insane, his mother signed the order. He was found dead the next day in a shallow lake, his pockets stuffed with notes about Parsifal. The official cause was suicide. The truth, he was murdered by the very fantasy of love his mother sold him. Schopenhauer would have nodded grimly. He wrote, "The boy raised on legends becomes the man destroyed by them." But here's the twist, the reason most men never break free. They confuse hatred of women with fear of them. Schopenhauer did neither. He analyzed them, the way a virologist analyzes a deadly strain. On women, he drops this atomic statement: women are the second sex in every respect, so always treat them as such, and they will secretly thank you for it. This isn't misogyny, it's strategy. Women don't want equality, they want hierarchy. They despise men who pedestalize them because it forces them to look down on what they'd rather look up to. A 2013 study in Personality and Social Psychology Review confirmed it. Women consistently rate ambitious men as more attractive until those men achieve dominance, at which point they're perceived as threatening. So what's the solution? Stop seeking love. Start wielding power. Not the brutish, insecure power of the gym bro or the billionaire, the kind of power Schopenhauer cultivated, the power of indifference. He lived alone, dined alone, and wrote alone. When a woman flirted with him in a Frankfurt salon, he replied, "Madam, I have no need of your admiration, nor of your body." Most men hear that and think, what a sad, lonely life. But Schopenhauer was free. Free from the cycle of pursuit and rejection, free from the existential terror of being unwanted. Because here's the darkest truth of all. Women don't fear men who hate them. They fear men who don't care. Think of the last time a woman ghosted you. The panic you felt wasn't about her, it was about the collapse of the illusion that love could save you. Schopenhauer's greatest insight was that salvation doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself so ruthlessly that no one else's choice matters. So ask yourself, are you still chasing the approval of the sex that raised you to crave it? Or are you ready to do what Schopenhauer did? Turn your mother's rejection into the foundation of your sovereignty. Because now we go deeper, into the abyss where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes praxis, where you'll learn how to transmute your suffering not into art or isolation, but into something far more dangerous: invincibility. There's a story about Schopenhauer, one his biographers rarely mention, that explains everything. In 1831, cholera swept through Berlin, turning the city into a graveyard. The hospitals overflowed. The streets reeked of vinegar and burnt lime, the desperate remedies of a pre-germ theory world. Most who could afford to fled. Schopenhauer stayed, not out of bravery, but curiosity. He wanted to watch. He walked the empty avenues, noting how the dying clutched at priests, how mothers abandoned their own children, how lovers who swore eternal devotion now barred their doors to each other. And as the corpses piled up in mass graves, he wrote in his journal, "At last I see man as he truly is, a screaming animal, terrified of the dark." This wasn't cynicism, this was clarity. While others saw tragedy, Schopenhauer saw the raw material of transcendence.
He understood what modern men have forgotten. Suffering isn't your enemy, it's your forge. Most men today treat pain like a glitch in the system, something to numb with alcohol, drown in pornography, or therapize into submission. Schopenhauer would have laughed at their weakness. His entire philosophy was built on one brutal premise: life is suffering. The only question is whether you'll let it destroy you or transform you. Let me show you the difference. In 1944, a 22-year-old Jewish psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was thrown into Auschwitz. Stripped of his clothes, his manuscripts, his pregnant wife, gassed upon arrival, he stood naked in the freezing barracks and realized something that would later form the core of his man's search for meaning. They can take everything from me except one thing: my ability to choose how I respond. Schopenhauer had discovered the same truth a century earlier, alone in his Frankfurt apartment. While his contemporaries chased fame and fortune, he sat in a cold bath every morning, a practice he stole from the ascetic Hindu sadhus, then worked for 12 hours straight on the world as will and representation. He wasn't punishing himself, he was conditioning himself. To him, voluntary discomfort wasn't masochism, it was vaccination. By willingly embracing minor sufferings, he inoculated himself against life's inevitable catastrophes. Modern science backs this. A 2018 study in Pain Journal found that people who regularly exposed themselves to cold showers and endurance training had a 40% higher pain tolerance, not just physically, but emotionally. They handled breakups, layoffs, and grief with eerie resilience. Schopenhauer called this the ascetic imperative, the deliberate cultivation of hardship to strip away the illusion that comfort equals happiness. But here's where most men fail. They think resilience means enduring suffering. Schopenhauer knew it meant weaponizing it. Take the case of Toussaint Louverture, the Black Spartacus who led Haiti's slave revolt. Born on a sugar plantation, whipped as a boy for learning to read, he didn't just survive his suffering, he reverse-engineered it. By studying the French colonizers' tactics, their fears, their blind spots, he turned their own brutality against them. When Napoleon sent 40,000 troops to recapture Haiti, Toussaint's men, many of them former slaves who'd endured the same horrors, fought like demons. They knew pain. The French only feared it. Schopenhauer would have recognized the pattern. His mother's rejection, his father's suicide, the decades of literary obscurity. He didn't just bear these crosses, he sharpened them into spears. In Pararga and Parapolemena, he wrote, "The genius lights his own fire and burns himself on it, but from those ashes rise wings." Most men never light the fire. They spend their lives huddled around others' warmth, begging for scraps of validation. Then when the cold comes, and it always comes, they wonder why they freeze. Let me show you what happens when a man chooses the flames. In 1950s New York, a failed painter turned heroin addict named William S. Burroughs shot his wife in the head during a drunken William Tell stunt. Acquitted by reason of insanity, he fled to Tangier and holed up in a bug-infested hotel, sweating through withdrawal. Most would have collapsed into guilt or self-destruction. Burroughs did something far more dangerous. He wrote. For 18 hours a day, high on amphetamines and paranoia, he vomited out Naked Lunch, a novel so grotesque that it was banned in Boston. When asked why he didn't kill himself, he shrugged, because then I wouldn't get to see what happens next. Schopenhauer would have called this the will's perverse genius. Burroughs, like Nietzsche, like Toussaint, like Schopenhauer himself, had stumbled onto the ultimate truth. Suffering only breaks you if you believe it's meaningless. This is why modern men are so fragile, not because they suffer more, but because they've been taught to pathologize their pain. ADHD, depression, anxiety, all real,
but all commodified by a therapeutic industrial complex that profits from your weakness. Schopenhauer had no such luxury. In his world, you either used your suffering or it used you. So how do you start? First, stop running. That itch to check your phone when you're alone, the urge to swipe through dating apps when you're rejected, the need to talk about your feelings after a setback. All forms of cowardice. Schopenhauer's prescription was simple. Sit with it. Let it burn. Watch what emerges from the ashes. Second, ritualize hardship. Schopenhauer's cold baths, Nietzsche's 12-hour mountain walks, the Stoics' voluntary poverty. These weren't eccentricities, they were training. A 2021 study in JAMA Psychiatry found that men who practiced regular fasting and cold exposure showed not just improved stress resilience, but structural changes in brain regions associated with emotional regulation. Finally, and this is the hardest part, stop seeking meaning in your suffering. The modern obsession with healing and trauma narratives is just another form of narcissism. Schopenhauer didn't write the world as will and representation to process his mother's abuse. He wrote it because the truth demanded to be written. There's a reason his greatest disciples, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Jung, all emphasized amor fati, the love of fate, not because suffering is good, but because it's yours. So ask yourself, are you still begging life to spare you? Or are you ready to do what Schopenhauer did? Stand in the plague-stricken streets of your own soul, watch the screaming animal within, and finally, laugh at its weakness. Because now, we go beyond suffering, beyond philosophy, to the one technique Schopenhauer used to transcend the will itself and why it's the only escape hatch from this prison of flesh and desire.
There's a moment in every man's life when the veil lifts. It might come at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling after another meaningless orgasm, or in the middle of a business meeting, surrounded by nodding sycophants, when you suddenly realize none of this matters. For most, this moment passes like gas, a brief discomfort quickly buried under Netflix binges and dopamine hits. But for Arthur Schopenhauer, it became the foundation of his greatest discovery. There is a way out of the prison of desire, and the key was hidden in ancient Eastern texts, while Western philosophers were still debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. This isn't mysticism, this is operational metaphysics. In 1814, a 26-year-old Schopenhauer stumbled upon a Latin translation of the Upanishads, the crown jewel of Hindu philosophy. Most European intellectuals of his time treated Eastern thought as exotic curiosity, like a stuffed tiger in a nobleman's study. Schopenhauer devoured it. He called the Upanishads the most profitable and elevating reading which is possible in the world, and for good reason. They contained the one idea Christianity had spent 1,500 years suppressing, that the self is an illusion and suffering is the rope burns you get from clinging to it. Let me show you how this works in practice. In 1980, a Harvard neuroscientist named Herbert Benson traveled to the Himalayas to study Tibetan monks. What he witnessed defied Western medicine. Monks could lower their body temperature by 15 degrees using only meditation. They could dry ice-soaked sheets with their body heat in sub-zero temperatures. One monk even sat perfectly still for 72 hours straight in a freezing cave. His metabolism slowed to near hibernation. When Benson asked how, the monks shrugged. "We stop being the one who is cold." Schopenhauer had discovered the same truth through philosophy. His concept of denial of the will to live wasn't suicide, it was ego death. A systematic dismantling of the I that craves, fears, and suffers. Most men hear this and think of Buddhist monks or psychedelic trips. Schopenhauer's method was far more brutal. You don't transcend desire by rejecting it, you starve it of oxygen by seeing it for the puppet show it is. Here's how you know you're ready for this. Think of the last time you were humiliated. Maybe a woman laughed at your approach. Maybe a boss mocked your ambition. That burning in your chest wasn't just anger, it was the will screaming as its puppet strings were cut. Schopenhauer's breakthrough, realizing this pain isn't a bug, it's the system working as designed. The will wants you to suffer, because suffering drives you back into its arms, through revenge fantasies, validation seeking, or numbing pleasure. The escape? Become the scientist of your own suffering. When Schopenhauer's masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, flopped in 1818, selling fewer than 200 copies, he didn't rage or despair. He observed his own disappointment like a biologist watching a lab rat press a useless lever. The will is a worm that eats its own tail to survive. This wasn't metaphor. Modern neuroscience confirms that the brain's default mode network, the circuitry of self, lights up like a Christmas tree during rejection or failure. But Tibetan monks and Schopenhauer discovered you can switch it off. The technique is deceptively simple. Locate the sensation, the tight chest, the buzzing skull. Ask, to whom does this belong? Watch as the eye collapses under scrutiny. Try it now. Recall a recent embarrassment. Feel it. Now ask, who is feeling this? The moment you look for the I behind the pain, something miraculous happens. It vanishes. This is what Schopenhauer learned from the Upanishads. The observer cannot be the observed. The I cannot see itself. History's most dangerous men mastered this. When the samurai Miyamoto Musashi faced 60 duels to the death, he didn't win through strength or skill alone. His secret? When you fight, become the void. No fear, no ego, just pure perception. Schopenhauer's contemporary, the dualist and philosopher Julius von Kirchmann, described the same state. At the moment the pistol fires, there is no shooter, only the shot. Modern science calls this flow state. Schopenhauer called it the brief death of the will. But here's the catch, you can't pursue it. Like sleep, it comes only when you stop chasing it. This is why most self-help gurus fail. They sell enlightenment as another achievement, 10 steps to transcendence, missing the cruel joke, the will cannot will its own demise. Schopenhauer's daily routine reveals the workaround. 7 a.m., cold bath to shock the body awake. 8 a.m., 3 hours of writing, no breaks, no distraction. Noon, 30-minute flute recital, strictly for himself. Afternoon, walk with his poodle, Atma, to remember that even dogs understand happiness better than philosophers. Notice what's missing? Goal setting, affirmations, productivity hacks, just pure, impersonal doing. A 2023 Stanford study found that people who engaged in process-focused activities, like Schopenhauer's flute practice, showed 72% less activity in the brain's self-referential processing regions, meaning they literally stopped existing as ego for those moments. This is the ultimate irony. Modern men chase purpose like it's buried treasure. Schopenhauer knew purpose is the will's final trap. The monks who dry ice sheets aren't fulfilled. The samurai who becomes the void isn't self-actualized. They're free because they've unplugged from the matrix of meaning altogether. So here's your choice. You can keep playing the will's game, chasing money, sex, status like a donkey chasing a carrot on a stick. Or you can do what Schopenhauer did in his Frankfurt apartment, day after day, as Europe ignored him. Withdraw your investment in the illusion. Not through meditation apps, not through psychedelics, through the merciless application of truth. Every time you feel desire, ask, who wants this? Every time you suffer, demand, show me the sufferer.
The answers will terrify you at first. Then, if you persist, they'll set you free. Because in the end, Schopenhauer's greatest secret wasn't about philosophy. It was about physics. The self isn't a thing, it's a process. And like all processes, it can be halted. The question is, do you have the courage to pull the plug?